Hello everybody, and welcome to my first set evaluation video for War of the Spark. I'm super excited and the set looks like a blast, so you should be as well. Before I got into my set reviews, I did want to go over the mechanics of the set, as well as some things to keep in mind when you are evaluating the cards and thinking about the set as a whole. Because when you're evaluating the cards, a lot of the way the cards play out is very contextual to the set, and this set is very unique, so I did want to go over the mechanics. So the three big mechanics in the set are Planeswalkers, Proliferate, and Amass. Those are the mechanics listed by Wizards of the Coast. Planeswalkers aren't strictly a mechanic, but there's so many more Planeswalkers in this set than there normally are that it's basically its own mechanic for this set. Also, there's a minor 4-powered or greater theme in the set, but I'm not going to be touching on that here. It's more evaluated on a card-by-card basis for that one. So we're going to be going through these one by one and talking about how you should change the way you evaluate cards based on these three mechanics. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up. It really does help me out a ton, and I appreciate each and everyone who does that. Leave a comment if you have any questions in the comments section down below, and be sure to subscribe to get updates whenever I post new content, including future set reviews for War of the Spark. But without further ado, let's get into it, starting with Planeswalkers. The Planeswalkers here, there's a ton of Planeswalkers. There's going to be a guaranteed Planeswalker in every pack, which means you will see them much more than you do in normal limited formats. What does this mean for you? Well, it does mean that you're going to have to do several different things. First of all, how do you use your Planeswalkers? In Limited, oftentimes you want to be using them early and often. So if you can play a Planeswalker onto an empty board, it is often correct to do so you can start generating value when it is not under pressure. Also, many of the Planeswalkers in this set do not have plus abilities, they only have minus abilities, and that means that you might be tempted to say, oh, I'm going to save this ability for later on. However, in many cases, it's best to use the abilities as soon as you can, so your opponent can't surprise kill your Planeswalker and then you got no value out of it, which would be a complete catastrophe. There are some cards that give creatures evasion, or they might have a removal spell for your good blocker and then they just attack the Planeswalker, so you do want to make sure you use the Planeswalkers early and often. If you have that Planeswalker in play, you usually want to be using it. If you do have a Planeswalker, another thing to keep in mind that you want to do is play your Planeswalker with protection. If you are going to run out your Planeswalker, you don't want to do it onto an empty board so that you get like one down tick of it and then it dies. You oftentimes want to set up a scenario where you're in a relatively defensible position, you have a couple of good blockers, and then you can play your Planeswalker and get full value out of it. That's going to be one of the keys to the set, whether or not you can get full value out of your Planeswalkers and whether you can deny your opponent from getting full value out of their Planeswalkers. Speaking of other players' Planeswalkers, you need to have a plan for killing Planeswalkers. If you are playing a deck, you need to be able to kill the Planeswalkers or deal with them in some other way. You can't just play a creatureless deck, because if your opponent plays a Planeswalker, they could just get so much value that you just lose the game depending on what Planeswalker it is. While some Planeswalkers won't just run you over with infinite value, there are quite a few that still will do good work against you. If you are going to play a creature-like deck, you need to have counter spells for Planeswalkers or have some other sort of plan for dealing with them, because Planeswalkers are going to be much more prevalent than they would be in other sets. Finally, I do want to give a cautionary note: do not overreact to Planeswalkers. Because there are so many of them, I know that when I first heard it, I was like, oh my gosh, so many Planeswalkers. But keep in mind that many of the Planeswalkers are not game-winning on their own, and a lot of the Planeswalkers aren't even playable on their own in Limited. So when you're thinking about the Planeswalkers, you need to be very stringent with which ones you're going to play and how you're going to deal with the ones that are on the board. Some of the Planeswalkers, when they are on the board, do sit there for a couple of turns and at like one loyalty with no ability to uptick, and those ones might not be as much of a priority if you are in a racing situation. Sometimes you can even let them just sit there, though as I will cover later on when I talk about Proliferate, a lot of the time it is best to just kill them off. And also, when you are drafting, just because you see a Planeswalker doesn't mean you have to take it. There are going to be cards that are better than Planeswalkers in this set, which is normally not the case. Normally you're like, oh, I see a Planeswalker, I have to take it. But in this set, there are going to be cards that are better than Planeswalkers, and you should be keeping that in mind when you are evaluating the cards. So that is just a little cautionary note. Don't overreact to Planeswalkers. Don't send all of your creatures at a Planeswalker if you could just kill your opponent instead. Those type of things. Just because they play a Planeswalker doesn't mean you're going to lose the game in a couple turns if you do not kill it. The next thing I want to talk about, which is related to Planeswalkers, is Proliferate. And Proliferate is a mechanic that when your creature does damage or dies or there's some sort of trigger, you can add counters to creatures or permanents. So what that means is you can add loyalty counters to Planeswalkers, and you can add +1/+1 counters to creatures. Those are pretty much the only times you will be using it in Limited, though it does have other effects in Eternal formats. So what we have to keep in mind with Proliferate is that the +1/+1 counters are the incredibly relevant part, because most decks in this format are going to have 1 or 2 Planeswalkers. They're not going to be full out, because if you keep in mind, if every player is going to have a Planeswalker in each pack, that means that the average player will end up with 3 Planeswalkers. However, if you do end up with 3 Planeswalkers, not all of them are going to be in your colors, they might not all fit your game plan, and there are some unplayable Planeswalkers. So that means that the average deck is going to have 1 or 2 Planeswalkers. And so +1/+1 counters are the main way that you're going to get value from Proliferate. So when you're evaluating the cards and looking at cards in your deck, if you have some cards with Proliferate, maybe value cards with +1/+1 counters a little bit higher. And also, if you think your opponent might have cards with Proliferate, maybe deal with the +1/+1 countered creatures a little bit easier. This Proliferate mechanic means that it is valuable to kill off low loyalty Planeswalkers. If the Planeswalker has like 1 hit point, maybe it's worth killing it, sending your 2/2 that way, and stopping them from getting an extra activation out of it if they are able to Proliferate on it. You have to evaluate whether the 2 damage to the face is worth more than the 2 damage to the Planeswalker that might not be doing anything, and also getting rid of that static effect from the opponent. But that is something to keep in mind. Killing off low loyalty Planeswalkers is something that is worth doing in this set because of Proliferate. Another thing to do is to keep Proliferate in mind when you're making trades. If your opponent has a 2/2 with a +1/+1 counter on it, and you have a 3/3 that has no counter on it, it's oftentimes going to be better to trade for you because your opponent might have a way to grow that creature because of Proliferate, and so the trade is beneficial for you. The more Proliferate you see out of your opponent's deck, the better that is going to be. And then finally, this is a big note. I want to say, make sure to utilize your Proliferate cards. And what I mean by that is if you have a couple cards with Proliferate, value cards with +1/+1 counters higher. And if you have cards with +1/+1 counters on it, value Proliferate higher. And Proliferate is the type of mechanic that there's like cards that will be just mediocre without the Proliferate, and then if you keep into account the Proliferate, then it can actually be quite a good card. For example, there's a 2-mana 2/2 that when it dies, you Proliferate. And while some people might not, if you just have that card as a 2/2 and it dies, it doesn't do anything, then that card's not very good. However, if you add a +1/+1 counter to a couple of your creatures, then that card becomes quite good. So you really want to keep Proliferate in mind both when you're drafting and when you're playing, because you don't want your Proliferate to go to waste, because that is a resource, and if you can use that resource better than your opponent, you will have a huge edge. Now, one thing that you can Proliferate on is to your army tokens. So the final mechanic I'm going to be talking about is Amass. And Amass is a mechanic where the card will say Amass and then a number, and you either create a 0/0 and then put that many counters on it, or if you already have that 0/0 called an army, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it. So basically, an Amass creature is going to be either a massive, it's called an army token, so it's either going to be like a small army token, so your 2/2 flyer might come with a 1/1 army token, or your 2/2 flyer might buff up your army token in that way. So what this means is there's several actually pretty key things for the set. First of all, bounce spells are much better in this set than they normally would be, because you're going to be bouncing a 4/4 or a 5/5, and actually they're much more likely to have a token creature in play, and when you're bouncing a token creature, you are going to be getting a decent amount of value. So value bounce spells a little bit higher than you normally would, and if you are playing an Amass deck, you don't necessarily want to go all in on your Amass creature, because your Amass creature could just get bounced. Another thing to keep in mind is that unconditional removal is better, because there are going to be more big creatures running around. If your opponent has a couple of Amass spells, they could end up with a 4/4, a 5/5, even a 6/6 or 7/7. I wonder how big the biggest Amass creature I'm going to see in this format is going to be. That could be a cool prediction, but I think that unconditional removal spells are going to be better, and you want to save your removal for the big Amass creature if you can in many situations. And another side effect of that is, because there are Amass creatures, there are going to be no pacifism effects in this format. Pacifism is a name that I'm using to account for all enchantment removal spells that kind of just put the thing on the creature and then that creature just sits in play. There are no pacifism effects in this set, because that would be really lame if you just pacifism their army and then all of their Amass cards went to waste. So they made sure not to put that in the set. So keep that in mind when you're valuing enchantment removal and whether to main deck it. It's probably not main deckable in this format, because you're just not going to be hitting any removal spells with it a large portion of the time. So keep that in mind. And then finally, I think this is where a lot of the skill of the format is going to come into play, is whether to save your Amass spells, because the Amass spells are much more effective, I think, a lot of the time if they're just generating a creature. For example, a 2/2 flyer that comes in with a 1/1 ground blocker is a very good card for 3 mana. However, a 2/2 that comes in and puts a +1/+1 counter on your already big creature is a little bit worse, I think. So, and if you think your opponent might have a bounce spell, it gets a little bit even more riskier, or if they have a removal spell or something of that nature. So you really want to make sure that you can choose whether to save your Amass spells for the right situation, whether or not you want to go all in on one big creature, or you want to just use all of your Amass, whether you want to save some of your Amass cards, so if your Amass creature dies, you have a way to rebuild and start getting a new army going. I think that's going to be a really fun mechanic to play out, and I really am looking forward to how it goes. Anyway, that is going to do it for the mechanics. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, be sure to leave those in the comments section down below. Hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you in my next video. I'm really looking forward to War of the Spark. Oh, yeah, I'm really looking forward to War of the Spark, and I will hope you are too.